Hello, it's Mark here from Yokel Bear Reads, and today I'm doing the second in a series of things that I'm posting called The Books That Made Me. And this is where I look back at books that had the most influence over me, that had a big impact on me, books that have stayed with me and I've never really kind of stopped reading. Basically, the books that made me and influenced me. Well, today it's not so much one book, it's actually an author. I'm going to be talking about the British author Alan Garner. And Alan Garner came into my life when I was about 12 years old, where at the library, and when I was 12, I spent a lot of time in the library, probably too much. Actually, is that possible? No, you can't spend too much time in a library, that's just an impossibility. But anyway, and I picked up this book, which was The Weirdstone of Brisingamen. And this is the 50th anniversary edition, which came out a couple of years ago. And the reason that I haven't got an older copy is because I keep lending it out, because I keep saying to people, you should read this, you should read this. And you don't get back sometimes, do you? Which is good, because at least people have enjoyed them. But this book had a real impact on me. Now, up to that point, I'd read The Hobbit, and I was quite big into fantasy because I'd read The Hobbit, and I'd read The Fellowship of the Ring. I think at 12 I haven't quite moved on to The Two Towers, but I think, and maybe this is something for another video, is that the Fellowship of the Ring, I think, is closer to The Hobbit than The Return of the King is closer to The Hobbit. As Tolkien said, it was kind of a tale that grew in the telling. But anyway, we'll do that one another time. But I found this book, and I knew it was fantasy because it mentioned on the back a wizard and stuff like that. So, I thought, well, I'm going to read this. And I was absolutely enthralled by this for one simple reason, which is that it was the first fantasy that I read that wasn't set in a fictional, made-up land or universe. It was set in Britain. It was set in settings that would be familiar to me. Now, at that time, I lived on the edge of a fairly big town, but we lived quite on the edge. And so basically, you could walk 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and you'd basically be in the English countryside. So it felt like we were living on the edge of something, a kind of a place that wasn't quite town, wasn't quite countryside. And very often this is what comes up in Alan Garner's book. The Weirdstone of Brisingamen is a story about Colin and Susan, a brother and sister, who were sent to stay with family friends during a holiday. And there is a legend in the place that they're staying, which is Alderley Edge in Cheshire, which is a real place. You can go there and visit, and it is, I've been there, and it is a very mystical, strange place in a lot of ways. But this story is about them questing for a lost gemstone called the Weirdstone. And it involves a wizard, and it also involves very Arthurian features from Arthurian legends. For instance, the gemstone is needed to make sure that 140 knights and their horses remain sleeping under a hill until they are needed. Britain needs them in a time of crisis. Also as well, what I loved about this is that it kind of wove in folklore, British folklore, and Welsh folklore to a certain extent, because Cheshire's kind of on the edge of, again, it's about those places that are not one thing or another. Cheshire is kind of on the edge of the top of Wales, and it feels, all the way through this, it feels that Alderley Edge is the edge between the real world and the kind of supernatural world, that it's the edge between town and city. And this book is just a real good fantasy adventure. Now, one thing I will say though is that as I've reread it over the years, one thing that I've realised is that the characters of Colin and Susan can be a little bit one-dimensional at times. Certainly with Colin, you don't feel as though you're connecting with him, even though that was kind of they're one-dimensional characters, and also as well, whilst I think some of the more supernatural elements, there are a race of creatures in here which are really out of orc central casting, to be honest with you. They are essentially orcs by another name. But aside from those caveats, this is a really good fantasy adventure that's rooted in real life folklore and myths. It's a retelling in a way of Arthurian legends, which I think is absolutely brilliant. I think more of that needs to happen, and more of it is at the moment. So I absolutely fell in love with this book, and then I found out there was a follow-up. And this book is The Moon of Gomrath. And it's the same characters. And the premise of this is, after seeing off the evil in the previous book, Colin and Susan unwittingly rouses the old magic from its slumber. And it unleashes something called the Wild Hunt. That's the Wild Hunt. And again, this is from kind of British, but also kind of Northern European folklore. This whole idea that there is a hunt that hunts for the souls of people in the sky. And the folklore kind of suggests that, you know, Odin might be the person leading the hunt. And even in Britain, I know down in Devon that there's a legend of the Wild Hunt where Sir Francis Drake, the Elizabethan explorer, is reputedly the leader of the Wild Hunt. And again, this is an absolutely great book. This one feels a bit more like an adventure story than the Weirdstone of Brisingamen, though they are both really kind of good adventure stories. But also as well, again, I didn't feel so much connection to Colin, but it's a really good book. And also as well, it has an ending that I can't tell you because it will be a massive spoiler. And that spoiler would probably ruin it for you a little bit, because I think you need to go and experience this ending. And it was also quite a shock ending in some ways. And then that was it. He stopped writing them. And I remember him saying, I can remember an interview with him where he said he just got bored of Colin and Susan. He didn't really want to write about them anymore. So you're left on a bit of a cliffhanger. And that was that, basically. That was it, the 2 books. That's all there was. Until 50 years later. In 2012, Alan Garner completed the trilogy. We didn't even know it was a trilogy. I think maybe he didn't even know it was a trilogy, but it was, it turns out, because he wrote the final book. And this is where things got really interesting. And that book is Boneland. It says underneath, if the sleep awakes, the dream dies. And what makes this really interesting is this completes the trilogy of the Moon of Gomrath and the Weirdstone of Brisingamen. But it's not a children's book in any way, shape or form, I would say. It's also a really hard book. A really, really hard book to understand sometimes. It's got adult themes, and it's set round about now. And the main character is Colin from the previous 2 books. And it's his story about how he is now as a grown-up after all the events that happen there. And one of the real adult themes is that it's clear that he is traumatised by what happened. And also as well, it's certainly clear to me, but I mean, I don't know, it's open to interpretation. I would say that Colin is possibly autistic, very kind of high-functioning genius level autistic, but it makes him a very, very complex character in here. Also, it kind of begs the question about the trauma and the way that he acts and the way that he responds to things in this book. The question's left hanging in the air is, did the previous events happen? Is he traumatised by the supernatural events that had happened to him? Or were they all in his mind? And I think there's an ambiguity to this book that I really, really enjoy. Also in there, it's not just the story of Colin, but there's a parallel story set in prehistoric times about a prehistoric shaman who is, or shaman, is it shaman? Shaman? Don't know. Anyway, you know what I mean. Who is having to perform rituals to stop the world ending. And again, I don't really understand part of that story, but I absolutely love it. And one of the reasons I absolutely love it is the fact that the writing dances off the pages. This is really well written. I mean, this is fine writing, very fine writing. I've read it about 4 times now, and I think I'm beginning to understand what it's about. But that's the other thing I like about it. I don't think the book should be easy sometimes. I think some part of the enjoyment with some books is the fact that they're hard, and you have to work to get the meaning in them. And also as well, what I loved about the fact that this book suddenly came out was that it was really obvious that he wasn't completing a children's trilogy. He wrote an adult book for the generation who had been brought up with the previous book. So essentially the story grew with the readership, grew in age with the readership. And I think that's great. And I think it's a real kind of, it would have been so easy for him to just knock out another children's book. But instead he did this. And I think that's what makes him a really fine writer. But also as well, some of you may be saying, but what about his other book, the one that we've heard of? Yeah, absolutely. The Owl Service. And this is the book that Alan Garner won the Carnegie Medal for. And again, it's a children's book, but it works on different levels. It's about how a young woman called Alison discovers a dinner service, a set of plates that has a pattern on them that looks a little bit like an owl. In fact, if you open it up here, you can see a picture of what that dinner plate looks like. And this one is about, after finding those plates, it sets off in motion something. It could be history repeating, it could be supernatural. This is all set in a Welsh valley, and again, that sense of place that was in the previous books is here. There's a sense in here of history repeating itself, time not being a straight line, and also it's kind of a retelling of one of the myths in the Welsh mythology, the Mabinogion, which makes it very strange and ethereal. There's an ambiguity to it that I really love. And it's essentially the story of 2 boys and a girl who may or may not be acting out and repeating stuff that's happened in history before. It's almost like a time loop of where this stuff keeps repeating over and over again. So yeah, I highly recommend this as well. And also as well, Redshift. Now, I think Redshift is possibly it's on a kin with Boneland, because it's quite impenetrable, this book sometimes, but it's brilliant. And I think that's one of the genius of Alan Garner. He can walk this line between something that's really quite experimental, but also really, really enjoyable as well. This is, again, it's about time, and it's about slips in time, and it's about stories in 3 different time periods that are linked by a particular object. And as you read it, you see how the stories are feeding off each other. But again, yeah, Alan Garner, Redshift, it's genius. I think it says on there, a superbly exciting piece of literature. And it is. There was actually a book that came out last year, and I think it was a crowdfunded book, and I got hold of it. There was a celebration book about his writing, his life, edited by Erica Wagner, First Light, a celebration of Alan Garner. And there was all kinds of people in here: Stephen Fry, Margaret Atwood, Ali Smith, Neil Gaiman, Philip Pullman, Robert McFarlane, all of them saying that Alan Garner, and there he is on the front, looking quite cute and, active there. yeah, his influence. He's like one of these writers that a lot of people haven't read him, but you've read stuff that has been influenced by him. Neil Gaiman claims him as one of his great influences. Margaret Atwood as well has said that his writing has seeped into her writing. So this is worth getting hold of. Why do I love Alan Garner? Well, his books are not straightforward. They work on different levels. Even the books that are children's books are something more. They're something extra. They're explorations of folklore. They look at time. They have this kind of mystic quality, dreamlike quality. They're set in liminal places. They're like the boundaries between knowing and not knowing, between the natural and the supernatural, between reality and something that isn't reality. But at the basis of it all, though, why do I like Alan Garner? They're just really good stories. They're really, really good stories. And he's a master storyteller. And so if you've not read Alan Garner, and he wrote loads more books, but if you want to kind of start out, start with the books that I've mentioned. The Owl Service is a good one to start with, or the Weirdstone of Brisingamen. But also as well, I think it's worth a quote from this book. I'm going to quote a professor of archaeology called Mark Edmonds, and he said this about Alan Garner. And I think that this kind of sums it up for me when he said, "There was something about Alan's work that made me follow him through the library and out into the hills. His novels had a mythic quality, but they were rooted in a world I knew, and they hinted at a depth to the landscape, a human, that seemed to matter even if I didn't fully understand it." And that to me sums up Alan Garner's writing. I don't always understand his writing, but I know that it means something, and it kind of resonates with me on a deeper level than understanding. But saying that, there are equally as much of his stuff that are just straightforward, really enjoyable adventure stories. So the books that made me, well, an author that made me this time, Alan Garner. Sir, I salute you.